maybe I'm doing, let's see, view. Gallery view, yeah. Mariana.
I look terrible, but here I am.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you?
Are you speaking to me?
Yeah.
I'm very good, Susan. Two doses. I'm almost free.
Me
March
too.
10th.
I've had 2 doses also.
Congratulations. Isn't that exciting? What does it mean then?
I don't know what it means, what we're going to do, but hi everyone who's on there. I see we have more people. Why don't you turn on your cameras? Love to have you. Hi Ruth. Hi Nan.
Hi, Susan.
Hi Ellen. Come on in, everyone. Hi Karen.
Drive safely.
I have to say, you know, by teaching this class, I'm learning so much because preparing is fascinating.
Thanks for the backstory, the little stuff that you send along with. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, even if we don't use it all, you have it if you want to refer
That's
to it.
Are you doing by any chance, what's her name? Benvenita Abravanel?
You know, I don't know her. When did she live?
She lived in, well, I guess the 1400s. She's known for, I mean, she's a relative, maybe Abravanel, if you think.
Yeah.
And she is famous for having for being litigious and winning the right for her to inherit her husband's property when he passed away. I mean, there's something of her on the record, so that's why she's known. And well, I mean, this is what I know, these little bits. And her father or her uncle, because, you know, there was this father, uncle. She married, and he was an advisor to, or a teacher to Eleanor de Toledo, who the Medicis married in order to have some royalty cred. And there's a picture of Eleanor de Toledo done by Giovanni Bellini. And that's about all I know. And I thought maybe some stuff had been fleshed out about her.
Benvenita Abravanel.
Right. Daughter of Samuel or Jacob Abravanel, who's related to Don Isaac.
One of the most influential and wealthiest Jewish women of early modern Italy.
There you go. Yeah, and
that's next week. Yes.
Okay, well, I just threw her out because she's curious. And yeah, she sponsored the False Messiah, so I understand.
Oh, from Shabtai Tzvi. Okay, I'm going to be using her.
There you go. Just thought you'd find some of her bits interesting. More and more comes out. Anyway, that's enough.
Thank you.
You know what I mean.
Hi, everyone. Did you hear that, Claudia? There's a famous woman from early modern Italy.
You know, I've heard of her, and I was trying, well, Stephanie, I think her name is, was talking. I was trying to remember in what context I've heard of her, and I can't remember.
Benvenita Abravanel. We'll talk about her next week. Next week, we're going to be, we're doing a medieval, and next week we'll start during early modern, and it will be the mystical women of Tzfat. Asnat Barzani, who lived in Mosul, Iraq, and was the first Orthodox Jewish woman rabbi in history. They just discovered her.
Wow.
And I'm going to add Benvenita Abravanel to that group next week. But I want to just, anybody else want to show yourselves? So there's 19 people, but only like 5 or 6 showing their faces, but that's okay. I know you're here. Actually, I heard a kind of horrifying story from someone whose boyfriend is a public high school teacher online. The kids are not required to turn on their cameras and they can be muted. So basically he teaches to like black squares and he has no idea who's there or not.
That's not okay.
No, it's not okay. And so that's why I invite everyone to show themselves. I'd love to see you. and hear from you. And
I connect to my television screen. It's easier for me to see. So when I disappear, it's only because I'm watching you and, so that it's comfortable.
so I look even bigger. I can't.
That's right. So
Susan,
yeah. So with
Su-
that, I'll say adios.
Susan,
Yes.
my son teaches public high school down in near the music center.
Right.
And of course, it's the same thing. They don't show themselves. He says it's fine with him because he'd rather have these kids show up than be embarrassed about their environment, about their homes, their parents, who's dressed, who's not dressed.
Right.
So he is totally clued into making it as user-friendly and not as confrontational as possible.
But do they talk to him?
Yes.
Okay, well, this
I mean,
never even knows if anyone's responding.
well, he wonders sometimes too, but he makes it very interactive. It really is harder on the teacher to keep them engaged, but he really respects their privacy and they're very, very conscious of their.
I understand that. So I want to welcome everyone. I'm going to start with a blessing because it's such a pleasure to study with you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu asher kishenu b'mitzvah v'tzivanu ba'asok Torah, engaged in the study of Torah. So I wanted to talk today about two medieval women in the place called medieval Ashkenaz. So Ashkenaz, we think of an Ashkenazi person as someone who is from Poland, Russia, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, or whatever. But really, the original Ashkenaz was northern France and Germany. And it was during expulsions that people started moving further east and taking their culture with them. But the original Ashkenaz, as it was known, was just Germany and northern France. And Rashi, the famous commentator, he is from northern France. He lived right at the very beginning of that time. He lived from 1040 until 1105. So he's just on the beginning of this high medieval time. And he lived in northern France. And just by the way, names like Rashi, that's not his name, that's an acronym. And a lot of the really great rabbis or scholars, their names were acronyms. So Rashi really stands for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, RSH, and then a Y, but we do I. So Rashi is an acronym. Another acronym, Maimonides, was called Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, RMBM, Rambam. So a lot of these famous rabbis, they were known. And the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement, he was called the Besht, which is the same idea that people use their acronyms. But anyway, medieval Ashkenaz, as we know, was in Christian Europe. And I gave you this huge document, but I mean, we're not going to read the whole thing. But what's interesting is that I wanted to first talk about the lives of women in medieval Ashkenaz, and then two women one who lived, again, like the ideal Jewish life, and one who was actually burned at the stake for her, audacity, basically, in her big mouth in that time. We'll talk about them at the end, but I think it's interesting to just get a sense of what the lives of women in this medieval time. Now, I don't know why. I didn't realize medieval times is from 500 BCE, as we say, Common Era, to 1500 CE. That's considered medieval time. Medieval, and there's low, and there's the high Middle Ages is near the end. And that's when the Crusades were. And so it's a huge, it's 1,000 years, really. And then things started to change in different ways after that. So the life there, how did the Jews get there, first of all? So a lot of them were taken as slaves to Rome. And then from Rome, at a certain point, they were just allowed to live there. And then they moved. They started moving west. So they moved west, and originally they settled in Germany and France. And some went to Spain also. So and that's really when the two cultures kind of split. They say that was around 500, 600 CE when they started moving to these different places. And as we know, the Spaniards, the Sephardic Jews, in Hebrew, Spain is Sepharad. That's why we have Sephardic. And if any of you have been taking Rabbi Buskila's class on Sephardic culture, he says, just like he hates that word Mizrahi, meaning Eastern, he says, just like Ashkenazi started in Ashkenaz, but anyone who speaks Yiddish, who has the culture, and all the people who went East are considered Ashkenazi, like Poland, Russia, etc. He says that anyone who has the culture of the Sephardic culture, whether they were in Morocco or Yemen or Algeria or Turkey, they're Sephardic. It's not Mizrahi in his mind. But we're talking about the Jews of Ashkenaz, and the only records that we have about the women are from men. We don't have any writing. In the next afterwards, we have actually, I'm going to talk about probably in 2 classes, Gluckin of Hamelin, who wrote a huge diary, Gluckin of Hamelin, about her life in the 1700s. And, very articulate, and we can see it from her point of view. But this, we only get from records of men. Some of them are legal records. Some of them are decrees that we see how women's positions changed. But a lot of information is known from a lot of sources about what the life of the medieval Jewish women were. And of course, we know that the ideal Jewish woman was a woman of the home, that she, and they talk about her, they talk about in the writings 2 kinds of women. The stereotype, this is on page 3, if you want to look at it. They're wicked women, temptresses, righteous women, good wives, bad wives, others. So they were in these, we talked about the woman of valor and, this ideal, and then real women who had problems and who interacted. What we find out is, despite the anti-Semitism of the church, and Jews were a lot of times protected, a protected class by the king or the emperor. And in medieval Ashkenaz, there were not a lot of ghettos, and people lived among each other. So Christians and Jews knew each other, and particularly the women knew each other, and they worked together. Or I'll show you what the Jewish women did, though, because of their husbands, they also did similar things. So what we know is that the ideal woman was the good wife, the mother, the daughter. And this example of this is this Dulcea of Worms, who we're going to read about in a minute. But and they say that the 2 professions that they list was on their graves, from their graves, is a midwife and a prayer leader. But they were much more. A lot of women had their own businesses, and a lot of women, this is interesting, like their husbands, they were money lenders. They were money lenders. They lent small sums. They had little, and then to other women, they say, I'll loan you this money and you'll pay me back at a very low, a reasonable interest. And sometimes they went in business. Now, why were Jews money lenders to begin with? Does anybody know? I'm sure Penina knows.
Because they couldn't be anybody else.
Right.
They couldn't own land. They couldn't be
That's right. They were excluded from so many trades and business.
Exactly.
And also, I know, because of the story of the money lenders that Jesus kicked out of the area where the marketplace was, and so they were deemed bad guys, and it was bad to touch money, I think.
Well, they thought it was, interestingly enough, in the Torah, in the Talmud, it says you're not supposed to charge interest to your fellow Jew. But they were sort of forced into this banking world because they, as I said, they weren't allowed in any of the professions. They weren't allowed in the universities. They weren't allowed to own land. So they weren't allowed in the guilds. So a lot of them were rag sellers, junk sellers, basically, and money lenders. And when first of all, so when they married, like a young couple married, it used to be that the daughter brought a dowry, and the dowry kind of determined what kind of husband she would get, because the better your dowry, the more you'd get a more eligible guy. But at a certain point, parents started giving sons and daughters money to start their marriage so they could start their money lending business, because this is how they were going to have to support themselves. So they would give them, a foundation to lend money. So that was one of the things women did. Just to backtrack, the normal age of marriage for a medieval Jewish girl was 12. She married at 12. Actually, 12 is considered the age of majority or the age of consent. So a lot of parents betrothed their daughters before 12. And a lot of times it was a business transaction, like, this family and that family will combine our resources, we'll marry our children or whatever. But after 12, one of the reasons they betrothed them so young is after 12, a girl could speak for herself and say, I don't want to marry this person. And she would be able to reject the marriage. So in order to prevent that, they betrothed her before she was 12, even if the wedding happened after. And there are some writings that say that a lot of times, of course, these children lived with one of the parents, probably the husband's parents, and they were raising these two kids. And they say that even at 14, a girl is too small for childbirth, wait till 15, 16. And so they talk about how the Jewish midwives would teach the young girls birth control. So there was already birth control in medieval Jewish circles, because they knew that you could die if you were too young or too small to give birth to a child. So they taught them birth control. We don't know what that is, but it's pretty interesting that they were doing that at that age. And girls were under the auspices of their mothers. Like, women raised their children until 6. The son was sort of under the custody of the dad, and he was setting up his education, but girls always remained in custody. The word is custody. So I'm thinking, even if they split up, the daughters stayed with their mothers and taught her the ways of, weaving and cooking and cleaning, and you had to make clothes and maybe even business too. So they say that the girls didn't know how to read Hebrew, but in order to run a business, you have to be able to be literate. You have to be able to do math. You have to know enough to lend money and keep track and sign letters of, IOU or whatever these are, these commitment letters. So I would assume that women were literate, I guess, in French, or they did it in Yiddish or German. Certainly in Germany, Yiddish and German were very close. I'm sure they could communicate. But we know Rashi, who lived in France and who explained and interpreted the whole Torah and a lot of the Talmud, he sometimes used French words when he was talking about things where there wasn't a word, or he didn't know a word in Hebrew. So he's probably spoke French. And so we're assuming that these women were in some way literate, able to read and write in the language of their country, or able to communicate. Yes, Merle.
Would it be that they knew conversational Hebrew, but not biblical Hebrew, in order to be a business person or whatever?
There was no such thing as conversational Hebrew. There was Hebrew. The only Hebrew was in formal Torah or whatever, or a very important legal, or even the Ketubah was in Aramaic. In serious correspondence between rabbis, they wrote in Hebrew. I was just reading, Hebrew is the only successfully revived dead language. It was considered a dead language, speaking language, for 2,000 years, or 1,500, 2,000 years, 1,800 years, like ancient Egyptian, like Akkadian, like Phoenician, like ancient Greek. All these languages died. And then when the pioneers moved, the Chalutzim moved to Israel, and particularly one man that obviously not him alone, but he's very instrumental, was Eliezer ben Yehuda, a Jew who moved to Palestine in the early 1900s. And he said, I'm reviving the Hebrew language. He wrote a dictionary. If you buy a dictionary, most of them are the Ben Yehuda dictionary. Streets are named for him in every city in Israel for that. And he figured out words for how to communicate, and he raised his children, his poor children, only to speak Hebrew. Nobody could talk to them because they didn't speak Yiddish. They didn't speak, Polish or German or whatever, the English, whatever people were. But he revived it, and it's the only successfully revived dead language on the planet. So that's pretty, yes. Nina.
Jews that came from Poland spoke fluent Hebrew.
They spoke probably biblical Hebrew.
But was the source, but they spoke Hebrew. My brother-in-law came from Poland speaking fluent Hebrew. Modern.
What year?
I don't know, but I know that my father came in 1929 and he spoke Hebrew.
So
and Ladino from Greece. Ladino was a combination of Hebrew and Spanish.
Yes, it is.
A lot of Hebrew words.
Yes.
And kind of like the musicality and all this stuff came from the Spanish, but it's a combination.
Yes, Ladino is the language that the Sephardic Jews spoke, a combination, like Yiddish is German and Hebrew, right. Ladino is Spanish and Hebrew. But it was Eliezer ben Yehuda who said, we're going to speak Hebrew in this country.
Yes.
And I went to Jewish day school. I remember when I went to Israel, I knew my biblical Hebrew. I could communicate to some degree, but all the words, all the way to like fluently speak was, he was very instrumental. And I'm sure people in the 30s and 20s were already like, yes, we're going to speak Hebrew. But this was the idea of reviving this ancient language that had not been used at all. What does this say, Jess? Also, what is that, Jessica? Where are you?
I'm here.
What does that say?
It's called Hakatea. It's a language that they use in parts of North Africa. That was a combination of Arabic, Spanish, and Hebrew. But the Hebrew you're talking about, Hebrew existed, is that the Hebrew in Israel is a modern invention. No one spoke it before. They spoke Hebrew, of course, but not the modern contemporary, conversational Hebrew that you're referring to.
People, in a formal way, or documents or scholarly things, but to just walk down the street and talk in Hebrew was amazing. So anyway, back to medieval Ashkenaz. So I'm saying the women probably, they didn't know Hebrew, they knew Yiddish, and they probably knew German, and they probably knew French as well. And they knew prayers, though. They knew the prayers. So that Hebrew they knew. They led prayers. They, of course, prayed separately from the men. And what else did I want to tell you? This was interesting. So going back to the marriages, apparently in medieval Ashkenaz, divorces were rampant. They were very common because, you married two people off when they were 12 years old. And by the time they were 25, or 20, they weren't happy. But there was a famous Rabbi Gershon, who made some legal changes that both benefited and didn't benefit women. The one that he did benefit women was he made a rule that it was forbidden to have more than one wife. It was still on the books. And in Sephardic Judaism, it's never been forbidden. I have a girlfriend from Bukhara. Her family's from Bukhara, which is part of Uzbekistan. And her grandfather had 2 wives, but Rabbi Gershon forbade that, but he also made it a little harder to get divorce on both sides because he made a ruling that if a woman doesn't agree to the divorce, well, the husband for sure has to agree, but if the woman doesn't agree, you can't divorce her. So you couldn't dump your wife for a younger model or whatever. So, and you couldn't get a second wife. The only exception for a while, but then they even took away that one, was if you were married to a woman for 10 years and she was barren, and if you wanted to take a second wife or divorce or stop that, you could divorce her. Those were grounds for divorce. But there are many, many grounds for divorce. I've talked about that in other classes. If your husband won't have sex with you, if your husband's cruel to you, I mean, there's lots of grounds for divorce. But he made it that a woman cannot be divorced against her will. So that was something new that he added to that. There's actually, in terms of this divorce thing, there's a true story. I may have told it to a few of you, but there's a true story about a man who was married, Orthodox man, in the last like 30, 40 years, who was married to Orthodox, married to his wife for 10 years. And she said, you should divorce me. We haven't had any children. She was barren. And he said, no, I love you. I love you. She says, no, I want you to divorce me. You deserve to have children. So he got divorced. And then they found out she was pregnant. But he was a Kohen. And a Kohen is not allowed to marry a divorced woman. So even though it was his wife, he couldn't remarry her because she was now a divorcee. So he was beside himself. His wife was pregnant with his child. He wanted to be with her. So he went to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. So this is a true story, apparently. He went to the, Menachem Schneerson, who was considered a mystic and, amazing man. And, people would go there and line up and they would stand for hours to go and ask him a question. So they went to the Rebbe and he told the Rebbe a story, and the Rebbe said, talk to your mother. That's all he said. And he went, but what is that going to do? And the Rebbe said, talk to your mother next, move on. So he went back home and the Rebbe said, so he went and talked to, oh my God, I'm sorry. Just turn that off. He went to the Rebbe and to his mother and he told her the story, and she said, you're not a Kohen, you're adopted. He never told you. And so he was able to remarry his wife. But that's like one of those mystical stories, but it also talks about this idea of divorcing because it was accepted you could divorce for barrenness. But I love that story. Maybe it's apocryphal, but you never know. You hear these stories about the Rebbe, so who knows? Okay, so the next thing that I want to tell you about women, just a minute. Oh, as I said, the women, another thing that women were known for is medicine. They knew herbs, they knew healing, and besides being midwives, they actually had cures. And they would exchange information with their Christian neighbors. There were Christian women who also were doctors or, medicine women. And there was another title for a Jewish woman in medieval Ashkenaz called Isha Chachama, like a wise woman. There were women that people went to just for advice, all kinds of advice about life, considered a wise woman. And that was actually a status. And I don't know if she got paid or not, but this was a role that women played in the society, and they gave each other advice. The other thing, though, is that women, had a lot of children. A lot of Jewish women who could afford it had Christian women working for them as servants, as wet nurses, as maids. They were very intertwined and they worked for them. The peasant woman would come and work for the Jewish women. And I guess that was a close relationship where they really knew each other well. We know during the Holocaust, even, we're talking hundreds of years later, those were a lot of the women that hid their mistresses and hid the children, that they were very close to them. They were part of the family. They even talk about during the Crusades, some of the Christian women or some Christians hid their neighbors during the pogroms of the Crusades. So despite, yes, there were, the church had, edicts against Jews, and they tried to do forced conversion, and the kings expelled Jews. On the lowest level of person to person, there were relationships, certainly between the Christian and the Jewish women. They were friends. They shared more than they didn't share. So they employed them. And we talked about the different businesses that they did. And I said the money lenders were also, but they also were artisans and sold their cloth and their their markets, whatever they did in the markets, they embroidered, they made clothing, they made art, and they sold that as well. And it says that they were merchants. Sometimes they ran the businesses with their husbands. They were partners with their husbands. I mean, you think about people marrying at 12 or 14, they really grow up together. And if it's a good match, they would share everything together because they would be so young and they would work to support the family. They had a common goal. Okay, let me see what else. They also, even women could go to court and represent themselves in legal disputes, we find out. So again, despite, any writings about them, we see that they were fairly educated and articulate. The girls were not required to learn to read and study Torah and all that, but they had to learn everything about running a business and about running their household. Okay, let me see what I see. Okay, and then religiously, some women were very, very pious and very religious. And besides just leading prayers, some of them put on tefillin and wore tzitzit and took Judaism very seriously. What we see is there's a huge range. There were business women, there were women who stayed at home, there were women who were in legal disputes, and there were women who were devoting themselves to spirituality. Just like now, we have a sense, even though they had a parameter, they made the most of their parameter. And I think I want to talk about these two women in particular. I want to see if there's anything that, they also, I gotta laugh. After this meeting, I'm meeting with the sisterhood from University Synagogue. And I'm looking at what they did in the synagogue in medieval Ashkenaz, and they were the sisterhood. They sewed the Torah covers. They took care of the synagogue. They brought in the flowers. They made the candles for Shabbat and made sure everyone had candles. They took care of the poor. They probably made the meals for the festivals. So this tradition of a sisterhood is like 1,000 years old, and that I know that the women I'm going to meet are probably doing the same thing to some degree. They also sometimes repaired the Torahs, that even, or made the gut, not cat gut, but the kosher vein, whatever, to sew the thread, they made it. So they were very involved in the upkeep of the synagogue, to just like we do now. They were always doing that then. And let's see. Oh, and this is the last thing I want to talk about. They write a lot about it, and I don't know if this is good. Two things. One thing was they were very willing to be martyred during the Crusades. I mean, a lot of them died or killed themselves and their children rather than convert or save themselves from the Crusaders. They talk a lot about these martyred women. Also, some record of women who then instead converted to Christianity to save their lives. So, to martyr yourself and kill your family or to become Christian. So that's, which, was against everything you believed, two horrendous choices in their minds. And we hear more about the praise of the martyred women, but, surviving to live for another day. And then some of them afterwards came back and said, I want to be Jewish again. I did it to save my lives, and it wasn't that easy. The reason we know this is there were all these legal disputes. Does a husband take his wife back, and are they divorced, and then they have to remarry? And, this is how we learn about these situations from the rabbinic arguments about how to handle it. I did not see that last chat. What did it say? I didn't see it. Hold on. My thing isn't even chatting, so never mind. Anyway, does anybody have any questions or comments of something they want to share or ask? Penina.
Okay, I'm just going to go back for a little bit to the language thing. The men actually learned it when they were preparing for bar mitzvah. So they had the chance to talk to the rabbi and study the text, because they had to do it in Hebrew. Girls weren't required to do bat mitzvah. I never was bat mitzvah. So my father came speaking Hebrew because he was bar mitzvah. He studied, and I had an uncle who was a cantor, and he did the services in Hebrew. He was chanting it. The women, because they weren't required to even go to the shul, because they had to watch over the children or whatever it is that's going on in the house while the men went or stayed home with the little kids, weren't required to actually be bat mitzvah. And I think this, because my aunt and my grandmother spoke Ladino for the rest of their lives, even in Israel. My uncle spoke Hebrew, my father spoke Hebrew, his brother, my uncles, the cantor, they spoke Hebrew. The women did not.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Bar mitzvah.
But even before, boys started to go to school at age 6.
Right.
And they were learning Talmud by the time they were bar mitzvah. Right. They were very, very, educated. There were fathers who did educate their daughters. They also have notice, because all of these are from documents, or they have to glean notices about. They would bring tutors into the house, and there were warnings not to let the tutors be alone with the girls, which suggests that perhaps the girls were being tutored as well with their brothers or whatever. But they were saying, don't, it's not modest for the male tutor to be there. But there, a lot of it was up to the fathers, did tutor their daughters. And so they were the more educated ones, the older, the more upper class, not older, the richer families were the ones that were tutoring their daughters, perhaps. We know Rashi, as I talked about last week, tutored his daughters, but we're going to talk about Dorothea Mendelssohn, that Moses Mendelssohn. We'll talk about the salonières in a couple of weeks, the women who started the salons. Moses Mendelssohn, who lived in the 1760, was the first considered accepted Jew into German society. He was, completely religious, wore a kippah, but he dressed in normal clothing and he mixed with society. I'll answer that in a second about the mikveh rules. And he raised his daughter, Dorothea, to be educated, to be multilingual, to be cultivated in everything. And then he wanted her to marry like a Jewish businessman and stay home and be a Jewish wife, an Orthodox Jewish wife. And she couldn't. And so she ran away from home and converted to Christianity, married a non-Jew who was a free thinker like she was, not particularly religious. And she started the first salon in Germany where all of the intelligentsia of German and Jewish artists, writers, philosophers, Goethe, Schiller, people like that, Heine, Rilke, they came to her salons, and she was, introduced non-Jews to Jews in a way. They mixed in her salon, but she rebelled because with all that education, she just felt she couldn't live the life that her father wanted for her. And that's, a few hundred years later. So anything else anyone wants to ask when we go to the two women that we're going to talk about? So I don't know.
Rabbi Nanus, can I just quickly, Penina's point is really interesting about her experience with her family. It's really fascinating to hear that. I think perhaps what Rabbi Nanus is referring to is that it was a biblical language that you would learn, obviously, to do the Torah and not to do mundane things. So I think that's the only distinction, is that the Hebrew that was developed was just about everyday working language and not in a biblical, which is why people didn't want that.
But it was taken from the Bible.
Of
The
course
roots
it
of
was.
the
Developed from there and then developed into a whole to involve, which is why people were sort of offended by it at the turn of the century, because they thought it should be about important things, not groceries, and so that was the difference.
Don't the
Interesting.
ultra-Orthodox still refuse to speak Hebrew in Israel, only Yiddish, because they say it's a Lashon?
No,
They speak
no,
now?
some of them maybe, but a lot of the religious boys, young men, they go to the army. Yeah. So it's an evolving thing, and we cannot generalize now and say that there are certain group that never, will speak Hebrew and stuff. I think it might be that the father did it, but the son won't do it anymore.
Right.
You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, so it's not something that you can categorize and say that group, this is what they do, this is it. It's not. It's evolving, it's changing. The Jewish boys that go to Israel today from United States to yeshivas in Israel also come back very different. I have nephews and a niece that all went there. As soon as they finished here, the high schools that were very religious went to spend a year in Israel. They came back completely different thing. They say no more 12 kids, I'm only going to have 3. And yeah, I have 2 of them that already talk like that. My mom had 7, I'm only going to have 3. This is it. And they don't have the pace anymore.
Okay, so you see they're modernized.
Yeah, you cannot generalize today because it's a very evolving and changing thing all the time.
Society. Yes.
And going back to the Yemenite women, I'm going to make it really fast. In the 50s, they brought a lot of Jewish families from Yemen. They didn't even know about the law of Rabbi Gershon ben Yehuda. And they came with 2 women, 2 wives. And the wives cried. They didn't want to leave the husband. So the government let them keep the 2 wives. And they said, fine. But the new generation that they produce, we're not allowed to do that anymore, not in Israel. But they kept them together. They never divorced on them.
I have a question.
Who has a question? Yes, Stephanie.
When you talk about women's 2 roles, I always go back to Esther versus Vashti. And I always think Vashti is kind of my hero because she stood up to the king. So I'm thinking, like, is there this strain of woman who doesn't fit into that mold, who isn't, Eve, the bad, or, is it just Eve and Sarah? I mean, do you understand? I mean, the role of women, well, of course you understand, but I'm just saying, so it plays out in medieval times, and I just get so upset when I see the way women are, as I know them. I don't know the minor characters, but they're the women who clearly are always like some of the scapegoats. I mean, even Isaac's Rebecca, she disappears after she's pulled her stunt of making Jacob the favored son and poor Esau. Do you know what I mean? And what happened to her? And I mean, so I'm just thinking, okay, in medieval times, I mean, women are just so squashed down and in the background. And is this reinforced by the Bible itself? That's my question.
So here's the thing. I don't think they were at all, because women, and particularly Jewish women, are never squashed down and in the background.
They come out the sides.
But they didn't they didn't keep diaries. They didn't write about it. And so we only have records that we can glean what they did, like legal records, legal pronouncements from the rabbis or whatever. And what we get is they had an extremely robust life. They had their own businesses. They had a very busy interaction with maybe more than the men. They were merchants. They dealt with the Christians maybe more than their husbands.
I'm just saying that biblically speaking, what reinforces these limited roles of women are, well, the Torah says this, and this, the woman of valor, this is a good person, and those messages, thank God I wasn't born a woman, those prayers, I mean, goodness, I mean, how do we, pull the curtain?
That's not biblical. Actually, well, woman of valor is, but if you look at Rebecca, she decided that her husband made the wrong choice and broke the rule. And if you look at Deborah, she was a judge and a warrior, and she went to war with Barak. That's in the book of
So
Judges.
that, I understand, but I mean, whatever happens to poor Rebecca once she makes that the right leader, she disappears. We don't know where she's buried, do
Did
we?
you read? Oh, she's buried in the cave of the Machpelah with Isaac.
Okay, well, then my
Read the red
history,
tent.
I have the book.
You
See,
should read it. It's all about the women, and Rebecca becomes a huge matriarch and like a prophetess.
okay, I promise you I will on the basis.
You will
of-
really enjoy it. It's the biblical stories told from the point of view of the women,
Mhm.
and they're very powerful. And the red tent is the menstrual tent where they go when they're having their periods, and they all do all kinds of rituals and things in there that the men have no idea what they're doing, and it's a sort of power for them. It's a wonderful envisioning of
Yes,
what they would
that
do.
leads me to where those rituals and all that around how impure women were during their cycle. That was actually the flip side of that is, oh, we got a little relief, and now we can be left alone and we can.
Yeah, there's two ways to look at it. But the whole idea that a woman's blood is impure, as I understand it, this is pre-Judaism. This is from ancient goddess worship. And even before then, that men feared women's blood because they could bleed and not die.
I see.
Would bleed and not die. So this blood must be powerful, frightening, whatever. They didn't understand it. And that taboo around women's blood is probably like 30,000 years old or something.
No, that makes total sense.
You know what I mean? They didn't understand it. And also, they didn't know, maybe women knew first, but they didn't know that sex today results in a baby 40 weeks later. They didn't understand the connection. So where did the baby come from? There was all this mystery. Women had this knowledge. And so, yeah, but this whole idea that you're unclean because of your menstrual blood is offensive to a lot of modern women and modern Jewish women. And yet Orthodox women, they feel like, oh, it's a time that I'm separate. They have another view of it. So,
and one last facet of this is that when the baby's born, that's why it's a matriarchy, because they know who the woman is.
Exactly.
They know where the men, who they were, so they didn't have whatever DNA.
Yeah, you mean the matrilineal descent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, that's pretty powerful stuff right there, but.
Right, but the Reform movement now recognizes a Jewish identity from either parent if the child is raised Jewish.
Of course, that makes total sense. But I'm just saying prior to that, this was.
But what's great about Judaism is that we can keep evolving and reinterpreting and changing, as opposed to this is what's written and this is the way it is. We're able to find, as the centuries pass and things no longer make sense or no longer acceptable, a way to reinterpret it or re-understand it so that we can live with it, as opposed to being, some people are frozen in time. We know some,
That's right.
but we don't have to be. And
Right.
you can go to Israel and claim citizenship, whether you were born a Jew or you were converted by any denomination. It doesn't have to be Orthodox. If you're converted, Reform here, and you go to Israel, you're recognized as a Jew.
Mhm.
So that's a big change. And they actually just yesterday passed the law in Israel. This is like a huge thing for Israel, that if you live in Israel and you're converted by a Reform or conservative rabbi, it's recognized. It wasn't recognized until yesterday.
Yeah, I know, it's maddening. And yes, and that's fantastic. We've lived so long. I mean, Lord have mercy. I mean, really.
Okay, so because of Stephanie, I'm going to start with the second woman, who is the rebellious woman. So if you have this page, it's Pulcelina of Blois. Blois. I don't know how it's French, B-L-O-I. How would you say that? Blois. Blois. Something like
Blois.
Say it?
Blois.
Blois. Okay. Pulcinella of Blois. Do you have the pages, Claudia? Do you want to read it?
I have them.
Okay, well, we'll start with Claudia and then I'll ask Ruth. You want to read about Pulcinella? Pulcelina, sorry. You're muted though.
I'm sorry. Okay. Selena of Blue, a 12th century female moneylender to the court of Blois, Pulcelina was implicated in the first ritual murder accusation in France and was burnt at the stake along with her 2 daughters and 30 other co-religionists in 1171.
Okay, so do we all know what the blood libel is? The ritual murder, the blood libel. I'm just going to say it for anyone who doesn't. It was this horrendous accusation that has actually almost existed until now, but it certainly existed in the 20th century, in the early 20th century, that Jews kill Christian children and use their blood to make matzah. It was horrible. And they would accuse them of doing this and then punish them for that. And they said this was called it's called the blood libel, L-I-B-E-L, blood libel, or the blood ritual murder accusation. Okay, keep going, Claudia.
These events are documented in a variety of Hebrew sources, including 5 surviving letters, a chronicle, 2 memorial lists, and 8 poems. This literary productivity indicates the degree to which this tragedy shocked the Jews of Ashkenaz. In his account in Sefer Zekirah, Book of Remembrance, the chronicler and liturgical poet Ephraim ben Yaakov of Bonn used the verb ohav, love, to describe the affection of Count Thibaut of Blois for Pulcelina. Most historians have assumed that the two were involved in a romantic relationship.
So she was a moneylender and had a relationship with the Count, which would have been the head of the city. And they said that he loved her, ohav, and that they assumed that means he loved her. That is the word that is used in the Torah to talk about how David felt about Jonathan. It's a talk about how Isaac felt about Rebecca. So people are assuming it was a physical love, but this other poet said no, he had a great affection for her. Okay.
So this would have been a Christian man, right?
Christian man, completely, yes. Because she was famous and she was probably very beautiful and wealthy. And if she was lending money to the Count, she was very rich as well. Okay, Ruth, do you want to read?
Sure. This theory has been challenged by S. Einbinder in 1998, who suggests that Ohav in this instance implies that the Count favored Pulcelina as a lender and perhaps as a trusted financial advisor.
So she was really smart. She was a businesswoman. She was a banker. So we see that, once again, it does not end well when you go beyond your scope. Keep going, Ruth.
Einbinder believes that Tybalt's wife, Countess Alex, who is described as hating Pulcelina and swaying the Count against her, was motivated not by sexual jealousy, but because she herself and others close to her owed significant amounts to Pulcelina and resented her influence over the Count.
So yes, Jews would lend money to counts and to the nobility, and then a lot of times they would very rich men, of course, lent money to kings for wars. And then sometimes when they didn't want to pay them back, they decided to expel all the Jews from their country as a way to get out of paying their debts. Mm-hmm. Would somebody else like to read? Does somebody else have the page? Sue, do you have it? Kasamasana? But you're muted.
Okay.
The surviving
documents make it clear that Pulcelina behaved arrogantly and was widely disliked by members of Tybalt's court.
Yeah, well, we have to take that with a grain of salt, because any woman who was, confident or, demanding to be treated as, we know this is today. A woman is judged, a man is strong, a woman is arrogant. It's exactly the same. Keep going.
That a ritual murder accusation could be brought up against Pulcelina and Blois Jewry when there was no corpse and no missing child also indicates the level of animosity her position of power had generated.
So people really didn't like her for her power. Yeah.
Ephraim wrote that once she was arrested, she was prevented from speaking with the courts for fear that she might convince him to change his mind and release the Jews.
With the count. They didn't let her speak to the count, not the court. So that's
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Although Jews from other communities attempted to ransom the prisoners, they were unable to offer sufficient funds to prevent her martyrdom. While in many ways this catastrophe represents a cautionary instance of the fall of a court Jew with tragic consequences for the larger community, Pulcelina's gender and the possibility that she had an intimate relationship with Count Thibaud give the story added dimension as an extreme example of the independence and entrepreneurship of Jewish women in Ashkenaz in the 11th and 12th centuries.
So here we only know about her because of her tragic end, but she couldn't have been, the implication is she couldn't have been the only one. There had to be other women or, that on that level of business and sophistication and education and knowledge, despite, the limitations of the society. The second one is the first story is about Dulcea of Worms. Worms is in Germany. And we only know about her from her husband's tribute to her. He wrote poetry about her, he esteemed her, and she was part of this group called the Hasidei Ashkenaz, which was a mystical, religious, pietistic group. And the fact that she was a member also says something about some kind of egalitarian vision of women in religion, because it wasn't a thing for men only. She also, and it was leading an ethical and very pious life. And she and her daughters were murdered by intruders. If you look at the 4th paragraph, we can read the texts about what happened to them. And then her husband wrote this tribute and talked about her life. So does somebody want to read, what do we have? We have a few minutes. Does somebody want to read the part about the intruders? Anybody? All right, I'll read it. According to these texts, 2 armed men who would apparently gain entry to the family dwelling set upon those present, including her husband, Rabbi Elazar, his wife, 2 daughters, at least 1 son, a number of students, and a junior teacher. The scholars assumed that the attackers were crusaders. There were no masked crusader forces in Germany. The 2 miscreants may have worn crusader markings, but they appear to attack the family out of criminal motives. So they were thieves and robbers, and they killed these rich Jews. So the thing that we want to look at is what kind of woman she was. And they say, again, she was a businesswoman. She banked money for her neighbors, and she lent money. She managed her household, including her husband's students and the teachers. And she also rethreaded the Torah scrolls. She was known for her needlework. She was educated. She read, she wrote, she did business. And so we see that even the most idealistic woman, Jewish woman, was educated and in business. So I guess Jews have been in business, and Jewish women are very good business women for a long time. That's what we're good at, and very astute and organized, and really part of a larger enterprise of the family. But the women had an important role. And once, they were allowed, once we're allowed in university and getting education, we rise to the top. So that's the good news. Does anyone have any questions or comments? She seemed to mentor other women. Yes, that's right. She mentored other women as well. So unlike, this seems like the Society of Women was very supportive, that they took care of each other, they supported each other, they gave advice to each other, and in their communities, it was a sisterhood, in the literal, like a temple sisterhood, but a sisterhood of support for each other. Anybody have any questions or comments or anything before we? Yes, Nina. Oh, no, it's okay.
I can't pinpoint the source where I read it. And looking back at the time when the Jews were money lenders, they were also the tax collectors for the lords and the landowners who weren't Jewish on purpose, because the people that they have to pay the tax and pay back their loans would dislike and hate the person who comes to ask for it back or to collect it back. They weren't the most favorite people in the community. They hated them. So it was meant to convert this, to direct this hatred to the Jews on purpose. So they wouldn't have to be the ones who come to collect it. They hired a Jewish person to do it.
That's true. They were the tax collectors. It was like, this is more on the manors, the serfs, you know, and had to pay rent, or the people who paid rent. They sent the Jews to collect them, and they were hated for that. And they were associated. This is the whole stereotype about money.
Yeah, in England, the lords who owns the land sent the Jewish people, Jewish employees of theirs to collect the taxes from the.
That's right. You're absolutely right. Ruth, you want to say something before we
Just
end?
wanted to say that nothing much has changed in that very religious society. My granddaughter still works with 3 children, still works full days so that her husband can study in yeshiva.
Okay.
Well, yes. However, in medieval Ashkenaz, there was that strata of that, but there were also a lot of men that worked. And the man, husband and wife, they worked together as business partners, or she had a business and he had a business. A lot of times they were merchants and they went traveling around, and she stayed home and ran another business. But you're right, of the scholar strata, that was the ultimate. And I would love to continue, but I have to go to another meeting with the sisterhood now. Anyone who wants this, could a woman work for a man during medieval times? I bet not. I bet a Jewish woman did not work for maybe another Jewish man, but probably it stayed in the family. She certainly wouldn't have worked for, well, I don't know. I don't know why I'm saying that. I'm going to research it. It seems like not, but I don't know. She would have to have her own business. Yes, that would be, but also, she didn't want to share she was maybe felt she was smarter, you know, that she learned from her family and they knew the business. But I need to go. But next week we're doing mystical women of Safed and Asnat Barzani. I'll send you it. This amazing Kurdish Jewish woman rabbi. And I'm also going to look at that other woman that was recommended to me. I wrote it down. So we'll see all of them next week. Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
Thanks.
Bye.